She rescued a man who was supposed to die, and now his people have come to tell her that by their laws, he belongs to her. If you enjoy stories of the Old West and the unshakable bonds forged in hardship, like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, settle in for the story. The rain came without warning, a grey sheet of fury that turned the dry arroyo into a churning, muddy beast. For 3 days, Sarah had watched from the single window of her cabin as the storm scoured the high canyon, listening to the roar of water that had replaced the usual whisper of the wind through the pines. She had come to this place for silence, for an isolation so profound it could swallow the memories that haunted her. She had built this life with her own 2 hands, felling the timber, chinking the logs, and learning the hard rhythms of survival. The solitude was her shield. But on the 4th day, as the rain softened to a sullen drizzle and the creek began to recede, the silence was broken. It was a flicker of color against the dun-colored mud of the bank, a swatch of dark fabric and the pale gleam of skin. She grabbed her heavy cloak and the rifle she always kept leaning by the door, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. The wilderness rarely offered gifts, it mostly presented problems, and this looked like the worst kind. He was half submerged in the shallows, tangled in the roots of an upended cottonwood, his face turned away from her. She moved with practiced caution, her boot sinking into the soft earth, the rifle held ready. He was big, much bigger than he'd looked from the cabin, with a cascade of wet, black hair plastered across his broad back. As she drew closer, she saw the intricate symbols painted on his skin, the deerskin of his leggings, the formidable stillness of him. He was not a prospector or a trapper. He was Apache. And he was unconscious, a deep gash bleeding sluggishly from his temple. Every instinct screamed at her to leave him, to retreat to the safety of her cabin and let the wilderness claim what was its own. This was a danger she could not name, a complication her fragile peace could not afford. But then his hand, lying half open on the mud, twitched. A shudder ran through his body, a primal, involuntary fight for life. She saw not an Apache, not a threat, but a man drowning in inches of water. With a curse that was swallowed by the sigh of the wind, she slung the rifle over her shoulder and waded into the cold, swirling water, her own hard-won solitude about to be washed away by the flood. Getting him back to the cabin was a brutal, lung-searing ordeal. He was a dead weight of muscle and bone, and she was forced to drag him, inch by agonizing inch, up the slick, muddy bank. Her cabin, once a sanctuary, felt small and fragile as she hauled him through the door and onto the bearskin rug before the cold hearth. For a long time, she just stood over him, gasping for breath, rain and sweat dripping from her brow. He was a piece of the storm, a wild and unknown element brought right into the heart of her world. His face, now visible, was stark and angular, a study in harsh lines and uncompromising strength, even in unconsciousness. A faded scar cut through one eyebrow, and his lips were set in a line that suggested he had never known much of softness. Gently, she began the work of saving him. With scissors, she cut away the soaked deerskin tunic, revealing a chest and shoulders corded with muscle and decorated with more of the faded, symbolic markings. She cleaned a gash on his head, her touch surprisingly steady as she stitched the skin together with a fine needle and gut. She washed the mud from his skin, cataloguing his injuries, bruised ribs, a wrenched shoulder, dozens of smaller cuts and scrapes. He was battered but not broken. As she worked, she felt his spirit, a core of unyielding iron that even the raging water could not extinguish. She wrapped him in drywall blankets and built up the fire until the small room was filled with a dancing, golden warmth. Then, she sat in her straight-back chair, the rifle across her laps, and she watched him breathe. The rhythm of his chest rising and falling was the only sound besides the crackle of the flames. She did not know his name, or his people, or what had brought him to the creek. She only knew that she had interfered with fate. She had pulled him from the edge of one world and into hers, and now she would have to face the consequences of that choice. The silence in the cabin was no longer her own. It was shared, and it was heavy with the weight of a life she now held in her hands. He woke 3 days later. Sarah was stirring a thin rabbit stew over the fire when she saw his eyes flicker open. They were dark, so dark they seemed to hold the shadow of the mountains at dusk. They fixed on her, not with confusion or fear, but with a sharp, assessing intelligence that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply watched her as if she were a puzzle he was slowly trying to piece together. She ladled some of the broth into a bowl and carried it to him. She knelt by his side, the heat of the bowl warming her hands. She offered it to him without a word. For a long moment, he just stared at her, his gaze unwavering. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and took the bowl. His fingers brushed against hers, his skin calloused and warm. The brief contact was like a spark in the quiet room. He drank the broth slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. When he was finished, he held the empty bowl out to her. Their silent transaction was complete. Thus began their new reality. The days unfolded in a shared, unspoken rhythm. Sarah would tend to her garden, check her snares, and maintain the cabin. He would lie by the fire, his strength slowly returning, his gaze following her every move. The silence was a language all its own. A slight nod of his head was thanks for a fresh bandage. A glance from her toward the water bucket was a request he could not yet fulfill. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the tightening of his jaw when pain flared in his ribs, the slight softening of his eyes when he watched the fire. She found herself talking to him in her head, telling him about the hawk that nested in the tall pine, or the way the morning light hit the western ridge. She never spoke the words aloud. He was a presence, a solid and grounding force in her small universe. His stillness was not empty, it was patient, watchful. One afternoon, while she was mending a tear in her cloak, he sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot she had given him. He tested his weight, his face a mask of concentration. He stood, swaying for a moment, and her hand tightened on her needle, ready to catch him. But he steadied himself, his hand flat against the rough-hewn log wall. He took one step, then another. He walked to the door and looked out at the vast, empty wilderness that was his home and her hiding place. He stood there for a long time, a silhouette against the harsh light, and for the first time, she felt a pang of fear not for herself, but for him. She feared he would simply walk away, back into the wild, leaving her with a silence that would now feel more like an absence than a comfort. The turning point came a week after he first stood. Sarah woke to the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. For a panicked moment, her mind, still foggy with sleep, registered an intruder. She reached for the rifle, her body tensing, before the reality of the sound settled in. It was a steady, powerful rhythm, each strike clean and final. She pulled on her boots and cloak and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and frost. He was at the woodpile, her axe in his hands. He wore a pair of her late husband's trousers, cinched at the waist with a strip of leather, the fabric straining across his powerful thighs. He was shirtless despite the chill, and the rising sun caught the sheen of sweat on his back. He moved with an economy of motion, a fluid grace that was mesmerizing. He would set a log on the block, lift the axe, and bring it down in a single, perfect arc. The wood exploded apart. He didn't acknowledge her presence, but she knew he was aware of her. He was no longer the injured man she had tended. He was power. He was purpose. He was taking a piece of her burden, lifting it from her shoulders without a word being spoken. She watched him for a long time, the pile of split wood growing steadily, a bulwark against the coming winter. When she went back inside to start the coffee, the cabin felt different. It was no longer just her space. A subtle shift had occurred. He was not a guest, not a patient. He was a part of the life of this place. That day, he set his own snares, his skill far exceeding her own. The next evening, they ate not her stringy rabbit, but a plump grouse he had brought back, roasted over the fire. He had cleaned it by the creek, prepared it with a knowledge that was bone deep, and cooked it on a spit he fashioned from a green branch. They ate in their usual silence, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. But the silence had changed. It was no longer a space between two strangers. It was a shared quiet, filled with the unspoken understanding of mutual effort, of survival. He was providing. He was protecting. His actions spoke a language clearer than any words, a language of responsibility and respect. He was repaying the debt of his life not with gratitude, but with the quiet, steadfast offering of his strength. And in the heart of her carefully constructed solitude, Sarah found a strange and unexpected sense of safety she hadn't realized she was missing. He started to speak a few days later. His voice, when it came, was deeper than she had imagined, a low rumble like stones shifting in a riverbed. It was reserved for necessities. More wood, he would say, and the pile would grow. Water is low, and he would return with 2 full buckets, the yoke across his shoulders making the task look effortless. She learned his name was Kale. He offered it one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the cold, clear sky. He had pointed to a constellation she did not know. "The hunter," he said. She had looked at him, a question in her eyes. "My people call him that." He paused, his gaze still on the sky. "I am Kale." He did not offer more, and she did not ask. His past was a closed door, just as hers was. She lived with the ghosts of a crowded, noisy city, of a man whose words were as sharp as knives. Kale seemed to live with the ghosts of the open land, of a people she could not imagine. They were 2 solitudes, orbiting each other in the confines of the small cabin. Their days settled into a new pattern, a partnership forged in silence and shared labor. He took over the hunting, his knowledge of the land so complete it felt mystical. He would disappear at dawn and return at dusk with game, his movements as quiet as a shadow. She managed the cabin, the garden, mended their clothes, and prepared the food. They worked in tandem, their movements weaving around each other in the small space with an unpracticed, instinctual grace. One evening, she was kneading dough, her hands covered in flour. He had been cleaning his knife by the fire, the stone making a soft, rhythmic scraping sound. He stopped and looked at her hands. She had always been self-conscious of them, they were chapped and calloused from her work, the nails broken. He said nothing, but the next morning, a small, carved wooden bowl sat on the table beside her plate. It was filled with a dark, fragrant salve. She looked at him, and he gave a barely perceptible nod toward the bowl before turning his attention to his breakfast. She hesitantly dipped a finger into the ointment. It was made of bare grease and herbs she recognized, yarrow and calendula, and it smelled of pine needles and earth. As she rubbed it into her sore hands, the gesture felt more intimate than any touch they had shared. It was an act of seeing. He had seen her small pain and had tended to it, silently, capably. The unspoken tension between them began to shift, to transform from the wariness of strangers into the quiet, powerful pull of something deeper, something she did not dare put a name to. The riders appeared on the ridge at sunrise. 3 of them, sitting motionless on their horses, their dark forms silhouetted against the pale pink sky. They were not cowboys or prospectors. They sat with the innate stillness of the mountains themselves, watching the cabin with an unnerving patience. Sarah's hand went to the rifle by the door, her blood running cold. Her peace was about to be shattered. Kale was outside, splitting the last of the morning's kindling. He stopped, the axe held loosely in one hand, and slowly straightened to his full height. He had seen them too. He did not look surprised or afraid. He simply watched them, his body a study in calm readiness. He turned his head and looked at her where she stood in the doorway. "Stay inside," he said. It was not a request, it was a command, soft but absolute. He set the axe down and walked out into the clearing, his hands open and at his sides. He stood there, a lone figure waiting, as the 3 riders began their slow descent toward the cabin. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She disobeyed him, stepping back into the shadows of the doorway but keeping the clearing in sight, the heavy weight of the rifle a cold comfort in her hands. These men were his people. They wore the same deerskin leggings, their long black hair bound with leather ties. They were older, their faces weathered maps of hardship and wisdom. The lead rider, a man with hair as white as the winter snow, dismounted and approached Kale. They did not embrace or greet each other in any way she recognized. They simply stood before each other, speaking in their own tongue. The language was guttural and melodic, a series of sounds that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The conversation was brief, their tones serious and measured. Kale's face remained an unreadable mask, but Sarah saw a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before. He gestured toward the cabin, toward her. The old man's eyes, dark and piercing, found her in the shadows. His gaze was not hostile, but it was heavy, filled with an ancient gravity that seemed to see right through her, laying bare the secrets of her past and the frightened uncertainty of her future. He held her gaze for a long moment, then turned back to Kale and said something that made Kale's jaw tighten. The test she had been dreading was here. The world she had hidden from had found her, brought to her door by the man she had saved. The old man approached the cabin, his steps slow and deliberate. Kale walked beside him, a silent, formidable guard. The other two men remained with the horses, their faces impassive. Sarah stood her ground in the doorway, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. The old man stopped a few feet from her. His face was a testament to a long and difficult life, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He looked at her, then at the tidy cabin, the well-tended garden, the neat stack of firewood. He took it all in, his assessment thorough and silent. Then he spoke, his voice a low rasp, like dry leaves skittering across rock. He spoke in English, the words heavily accented but clear. "He is Kale," the man said, gesturing to the chief beside him. "He is the leader of our people. The storm took him. The river spirit claimed him." He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You pulled him from the water. You brought him back from the spirit world." Sarah said nothing, her throat too tight for words. She could only nod, a small, jerky movement. The old man's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "Our way is old," he continued, his voice taking on a formal, storytelling cadence. "When a life is given back, a debt is made. A life for a life. The one who saves a life is responsible for that life. The one who is saved belongs to their savior." He let the words hang in the cold morning air, their weight settling upon her, heavy and inescapable. She stared at him, trying to comprehend the meaning behind his strange, poetic pronouncements. "By the tradition of our people," the old man said, his voice dropping to a solemn, final tone, "you have claimed his spirit. You have bound him to you. He is your husband." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Husband. The word was an absurdity, a relic from a life she had burned to the ground. She looked from the old man's implacable face to Kale. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, but for the first time she saw a flicker of something in his dark eyes, a question, a vulnerability. He was not a chief here, not a leader of his people. He was a man held captive by a tradition she did not understand, his fate placed squarely in the hands of the strange, solitary woman who had found him half dead in the mud. The silence stretched, broken only by the sigh of the wind in the pines. The elder did not wait for an answer. It was not a proposal to be considered, but a fact to be stated. He spoke again to Kale in their own language, his tone now softer, more personal. Kale responded with a few short, guttural words. The old man nodded, a look of profound understanding passing between them. He then turned back to Sarah. "We will leave you," he said. "This is a matter for a man and his wife to settle." He gave her a long, final look, a look that held respect and a surprising degree of sympathy, as if he understood the monumental weight he had just placed upon her. He walked back to his horse, mounted in a single fluid motion, and without a backward glance, he and the other two men rode back up the ridge and disappeared over the crest, leaving behind nothing but the hoof prints in the soft earth and a silence that was now deafening. Sarah stood frozen, the rifle feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. Husband. The word echoed in her mind, nonsensical and yet terrifyingly real. She finally looked at Kale. He had not moved. He was still watching her, waiting. The stoic mask was still in place, but she could see the tension in the corded muscles of his neck, the rigid set of his shoulders. The power had shifted entirely. He was a chief, a leader of men, yet in this moment, his future rested on her word. He was bound to her by a law she had never known existed. She could send him away. She could tell him to go with his people, to return to his life, and he would have to obey. It was her right, according to them. The thought of being alone again, truly alone, sent a shard of ice through her heart. The silence that had once been her comfort would now be an unbearable void. his presence, which had at first been an intrusion, had become the very center of her world. It was in the wood he chopped, the food he provided, the silent companionship by the fire, the salve he had made for her hands. He had, in his quiet way, already become her partner, her protector. This tradition, this strange and ancient law, was not creating a bond. It was simply giving a name to the one that had already been forged in silence, in hardship, and in survival. She lowered the rifle, leaning it against the cabin wall. The gesture was a surrender, an acceptance. She looked at Kale, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to see the man, not just the survivor or the Apache chief. She saw the hint of exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of the responsibility he carried. He was not a complication. He was her life now. "The stew is getting cold," she said, her voice rough from disuse. It was a simple statement, a return to the ordinary, but it held the answer he was waiting for. A barely perceptible wave of relief washed over his features, a subtle loosening of the tension in his shoulders. He gave a single, slow nod. He followed her inside the cabin. The space was the same, the stone hearth, the rough-hewn table, the 2 wooden chairs, but everything felt different, charged with a new significance. The air was thick with a future they had not chosen but would now have to build together. She ladled the stew into 2 bowls and placed them on the table. He sat, and she sat opposite him. They ate, the familiar silence settling around them once more. But it was a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the comfortable silence of companions. It was the deep, resonant silence of a beginning, the quiet understanding between 2 people bound together not by vows spoken before a crowd, but by the irrefutable act of a life saved, a debt claimed, and a future accepted in the heart of the wild. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, steady glow on their faces. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, but inside the small cabin, a new world had been born, quiet and strong, promising nothing but the shared hardship of the coming winter and the unspoken certainty that they would face it together. The days that followed were much like the ones that had come before, yet fundamentally changed. The routine remained, he hunted, she tended the hearth and home, but now their movements were imbued with a quiet sense of permanence. When he left at dawn, she no longer felt a flicker of fear that he might not return. His departure was a promise of his return. When he came home at dusk, his presence was not just a comfort, but a certainty. The space between them, once filled with unspoken questions and tentative respect, now held a different kind of tension, the quiet, powerful intimacy of a shared fate. They still spoke very little. Words were not their language. Their communication lived in gestures. It was in the way he would leave the most tender piece of meat on her plate, or the way she would have a mug of hot broth waiting for him when he returned, his hands numb from the cold. One evening, he came back with a heavy silver and turquoise bracelet. It was old, the metal worn smooth with time, the stones the color of a summer sky. He held it out to her, his palm flat. She looked at the bracelet, then into his dark, steady eyes. She wordlessly held out her wrist, and he fastened the clasp. The metal was cool against her skin, a tangible symbol of the bond that now tied them. It was a silent wedding ring, a marker of possession and belonging that went both ways. He belonged to her, and in accepting the bracelet, she acknowledged that she, in turn, belonged to him. Her past, the life she had fled from, began to feel like a distant dream, the memories losing their sharp, painful edges. The ghost of the man she had run from faded in the face of Kale's solid, reassuring presence. Kale never asked her about where she came from, and she understood he never would. The life they had now was the only one that mattered. He had been brought to her by a flood, a man with no past, and she had become a woman with no past to meet him. All that existed was the rugged canyon, the small cabin, and the life they were building together, one silent day at a time. The world had been reduced to this simple, profound truth. Winter arrived, blanketing the canyon in a deep, silent layer of snow. The world outside their door became a vast expanse of white, muffling all sound and sharpening the sense of their isolation. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and life. The fire was never allowed to die, and the scent of pine smoke, roasting meat, and drying herbs filled the small space. The winter months forced them into even closer proximity, yet the cabin never felt small. It had become their entire world, and they moved within it with a deep and abiding sense of place. During the long, dark evenings, he would work by the firelight, tanning the hides from his hunts or carving intricate figures into pieces of wood. She would sit nearby, mending their clothes or reading from one of the few books she owned, the sound of her turning pages a soft counterpoint to the scrape of his knife. One night, a blizzard raged outside, the wind howling like a hungry wolf. A powerful gust slammed against the cabin, making the timbers groan. Sarah startled, a tremor of old fear running through her. Kale looked up from his work. He didn't speak, but he reached across the small space between them and placed his hand over hers. His touch was warm and firm, his large hand completely covering her own. It was a simple gesture of reassurance, a silent promise of safety. He held her hand for a long moment, the storm raging outside while a profound stillness settled within the cabin walls. In that moment, the word husband finally settled into her heart, not as a strange tribal law, but as a simple, undeniable truth. He was the protector of her home, the partner in her survival, and the keeper of her peace. Looking at his strong, quiet face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, she knew she had never been safer in her life. The storm that had brought him to her had been a destructive force, but it had also cleared the way for this new, rugged, and beautiful life. She had rescued him from the water, but he, in turn, had rescued her from a solitude that was slowly becoming a prison. They had saved each other,